Hello, Sarah and Mark.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing? Let me introduce this. And let me introduce this format because I've been doing Blogging Heads for 13 years, and I think I've never done it with more than one person at once. So this is like we're breaking whole new ground. In fact, I'm not sure. Has this ever been done on TV or anything, like more than two people? Tell me if I'm not getting there first. But radical new format. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcasts. And I have with me to inaugurate this new format two of our most astute political and policy analysts. Is that fair to say? Does either of you object to that?
I don't object to you saying that about Mark.
Okay.
and I don't object to saying it about Sarah. So
okay,
we'll both say it about you. So
we're in agreement. Mark is a fellow at the New America Foundation. Oh, it's no longer called the New America Foundation. It's just New America now. Plus, you're not any mere fellow. What is your actual title?
I'm the director of the Political Reform Program.
Okay, we need more of that.
Yeah.
More reform, if not more programs. And Sarah writes about politics. You've covered in particular the kind of intersection of religion and politics.
That's right. And I'm a reporting fellow at the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. Excellent.
And we're going to, the plan originally, which we're mainly going to stick with, was to talk about the election, which people may have heard about. When I signed on to talk to you informed me that Jeff Sessions was stepping down as Attorney General, and that's a news flash. I think maybe if we have time at the end, we will speculate a little about that. But since by the time we even say goodbye, there may be more news on that front, I think it would be a mistake to kind of front load the conversation with that and risk being overtaken by events. So what did you think of the election? I mean, in the broadest sense, it was what people said would happen. The Democrats took the House. The Republicans kept the Senate. Were there things that surprised either of you? Okay, folks. Well, listen, thank you. Did the question surprise you? Did it surprise you that I said?
It didn't surprise you. It surprised me how much I care who the governor of Florida is. Not a state I've ever lived in or spent a lot of time in. But there were those points where you really felt like really one of the most outrageous kinds of campaigns that I've seen, where the campaign issue, in 2014, the big issue was Ebola, which was, at least was an actual thing that there was some reason to be concerned about. I mean, and here there's all the focus on, a caravan of people walking who are 1,000 miles away from the U.S. border and that sort of thing. The idea that any of that actually worked, even if it only worked in certain situations, was really quite disturbing. But the rest was kind of what you expect. I mean, it wasn't the 65-seat wave of 2010, but then the Republican majority was actually smaller than the Democratic majority had been in 2010. So there was a little less room for those giant gains. I mean, it was definitely not only by popular vote, but by number of seats, which looks to be something like 35 maybe or 36. It was very much what you'd expect in a midterm wave, and it was pretty much what one would expect in the Senate, without having to rush to say, oh, it was about Kavanaugh or anything else. It was kind of baked in pretty early that Missouri's a very tough state, so McCaskill was going to be in trouble. Manchin's survival was one of the more interesting events, but nothing. Nothing made me go into the way that the Trump election made you say, hey, wait a minute, maybe there are things I don't really understand about American politics. I mean, it was a very basic.
I think, you're right. It was, it was, as we said, broadly speaking, predicted. But it seems to me one thing we did discover there was very high turnout, highest in half a century for, I think percentage-wise in a midterm election. And I think what we learned from the fact that the Republicans did hold apparently Florida, both Senate and governor, did hold Texas. And so they did a little better in the Senate than might have been thought. I think what we learned was the huge turnout came from both sides. In other words, the Republicans did a pretty good job of activating their base. That was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. And I think that gets to your point about the caravan. Was that one thing that activated the base? I think it also gets to an expertise of Sarah's because, evangelical voters remain a big part of the base. Sarah, do you have a view on what was responsible for we know what was responsible for the level of energy on the Democratic side.
Right.
We don't like Trump. But right. What do you think what drove the turnout on the Republican side?
I think that for the Republican Party, the big chunk of the Republican Party is white evangelicals and ideologically similar white conservative Catholics, right? And to a lesser extent, white conservative mainline Protestants, right? So you have this white Christian base that's very dedicated to Trump, particularly the conservative white evangelical base. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, let's call it a belief that there's something supernatural going on with Trump. I spent the weekend before the midterms reporting on these sort of midterm, not necessarily get out the vote activities that evangelicals were engaged in, but it was definitely get everybody motivated kinds of activities. And the idea that Trump is some kind of savior figure for America is just pounded away at, and that his enemies are some kind of demonic force, whether it's actual demons or George Soros or something of that nature. And what I was seeing in the week or so before the midterms was a huge, huge uptick in this idea that this was your Esther moment, referring to the idea that, like Queen Esther saved the Jews from genocide, that it's the moment for white evangelicals to save America from some apocalyptic, terrible thing happening, like the Democrats retaking the House or Senate or what have you.
What do you think was responsible for the uptick in that sentiment?
Well, I think that they were clearly looking at the polling on the House races, and they knew, I think, that they were going to lose the House, and they know that they can still rely on those safe districts. They know that they can rely on the representatives in those safe districts to continue to carry the torch for them in the House. But if they're not in the majority, things are going to change quite substantially, right? But I think that when they saw that coming down the pike, they saw the urgency of keeping the Senate. Because if they keep the Senate, then they can sort of bottle up any legislation that the Democrats want or that comes out of the House, the democratically controlled House. They can stop any kind of impeachment activity because the Senate would be the body to convict the president if he were to be impeached by the House. And most importantly, and most on the minds of these voters, were judicial nominees and Supreme Court nominees. So if they were able to retain control of the Senate, then of course Trump can continue to ram through district and appellate court nominees who are really far to the right. And if he has another opportunity for a Supreme Court justice, probably somebody even more to the right than Brett Kavanaugh, because if we know that they have increased their margin in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And if they increase it even more with some of these outstanding races that haven't been called, maybe they'll get one or two more, and Arizona, right. Florida maybe, Arizona. That gives Trump a bigger margin in the Senate to nominate somebody even more extreme, right? Because then they don't have to worry as much about, maybe Susan Collins is going to get peeled away. Well, if you have 54 seats and Susan Collins gets peeled away, it doesn't matter as much. So I think that that's what they were aiming for. And that's the thing I think that Democrats need to be very worried about, because this continued stacking of the federal courts, the possibility that there could be another Supreme Court nomination in Trump's sights in the second half of his term. I mean, those are things that could ideologically solidify the Republican agenda for, a generation or more, and that's going to be a lot more long-lasting than whether the Republicans or the Democrats control the House.
Yeah. So This was going to be a question of mine. I mean, you two both know a lot more about politics than I do, but I was wondering, like, is there a difference between 54 seats in the Senate and them having 51? Because it seemed like they were getting the judges they wanted, but I gather you're saying that if they had 54 seats last time around, it might not have been Brett Kavanaugh who was nominated. It might have been somebody to his right.
Well, I think the interesting thing that the Republicans are doing today, and Trump did it in this crazy press conference that he had a couple of hours ago, but Republican and conservative activists are doing it in social media and so forth. They're reading their continued control of the Senate, and probably, by a larger margin. They're spinning that as voters' rebuke of the way the Democrats treated Brett Kavanaugh.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not just about the ideology of a future Supreme Court nominee or future federal court nominees. This is also all about the Me Too issues, the idea that the Democrats, went after this good man, and maybe George Soros was funding this idea that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted somebody or somebody's. And so they're really trying to spin this as this is their mandate to continue this march on judicial nominees. Yeah. And also the idea that the Democrats had mistreated Kavanaugh and that the voters rebuked that. I mean, obviously, the election is not a sign that the voters rebuked that, but that's how they're spinning it.
Right, but and adding to that, just there were only a tiny handful of Republican senators who were in play on Kavanaugh before and after the allegations. They were Collins and Murkowski and Jeff Flake, who's no longer going to be there.
Right.
And so, having 54, 55 gives them a little more room to maneuver. I often feel like that particularly McConnell, Don McGahn, and to some extent Trump have a mentality that you want to push as close to the edge as you can and still win. Like, any vote, in the past, a president would want, at least a chunk of votes from the other party just for validation, in some ways to overcome a filibuster, but also for a kind of validation. Most presidents wouldn't really want to push a nominee through on their own party line alone. That's why Obama nominated Merrick Garland, people like that, who they'd already had conversations with Republicans and thought they had something there. This is a very different approach. It's kind of like an attitude of anything you do that gets you those other votes. It's like leaving money on the table. You could have had a more conservative justice, but you did this you got unnecessary votes, and you left something on the table. This allows them to go even further, and maybe 3 Republicans defect from the next nominee, but they can still get it through. And you see that on things like the tax bill too. Like, there's a real desire to not even do the things that you would have to do to get a little bit of Democratic support. Again, in contrast to the way, for example, the George W. Bush administration handled its tax bill, where they really wanted to get some bipartisan validation. And I think I think all that analysis is right, Sarah. I think for some I think that's probably the analysis of the leadership. I think your first point, which is really like, this is about negative partisanship. It's really about the evil Democrats or, their allies. That's probably what's motivating it's really, for somebody who doesn't live in that world or report on that world, you kind of have to ask every day, like, what is this attachment between white evangelicals and Donald Trump?
Isn't it almost?
I feel like some things should remain a mystery. You should continue to be mystified by them because they're bizarre.
Well, but there is the transactional dimension. And, it's like he can bring them the judges. And it's funny, Sarah, when I first asked you what do you think energized them, I thought you were going to talk about the kind of emotive things Trump was doing to energize them, or that had been done with or without his support. I mean, like Kavanaugh was just an energizing tribal thing, leaving aside what Kavanaugh represented. And the caravan thing was an attempt to get people emotional, and calling the Democrats a dangerous mob. These were all things that could motivate people at an emotional level. But your response was very much, and I think this speaks to how kind of well organized in an informal, decentralized way the evangelical vote is. But your response was very much about, well, they kind of talked about it, and they realized, like, we need the Senate to keep getting our business done, which is the judges we want, Trump not getting, and so on. So,
well, okay. So I think there's several layers of this. One is, like you say, this transactional relationship that they have, where he promised them judges, he promised them that he would get rid of the Johnson Amendment, which hinges a church's tax exempt status on not, electioneering or endorsing candidates, which is something that he now can't do because the Democrats, and a repeal of it won't pass the House.
And Sarah, he didn't make much of an effort to do that. I mean, he
made no effort to do it.
What's that?
He made no effort to do it. He issued an executive order. He issued an executive order telling the IRS to not enforce it anymore, but the IRS actually hadn't been enforcing it for a long time. So it was just kind of this ridiculous farce. But the transactional relationship is about those things. It's about his judicial nominees. It is about his policies that are being carried out at the agency level, and were being carried out, by the way, by Jeff Sessions, who he just forced to resign. And so that's the transactional end of things. And then there's the access end of things. They're very pleased by the fact that they are welcome in the White House all the time. So there are very frequently meetings between evangelical leaders and the president, meetings between evangelical leaders and the vice president. I have talked to evangelicals who have told me they have Trump's cell phone number, they can talk to him. I've talked to evangelicals who tell me they've been to dinner at the vice president's residence. I've talked to evangelicals who say they have like an open line to Stephen Mueller, and they used to have an open line to Steve Bannon, open line to Javanka, so the access thing is huge for them because
3 of the 4 people you named are Jewish.
Well, they love the Jews, that, right? So it's the transactional thing, it's the access thing. It gives them the ability to say, we matter. We're not, the Republican Party isn't just using us anymore for their votes, but really then just catering to the elitists and the globalists. We really matter to Trump. And then there's the level of Trump is something that was prophesied in the Bible. And he's like a King Cyrus. And he's like the King Cyrus was to the Jews, bringing them back from the Babylonian exile and rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem for them. So these are the different layers and levels where the admiration for Trump is taking place. And so when you pull all of those things together, they might be all happening in one person, one voter, one leader, or there may be people who just, appreciate one thing or the other. But each of those things make evangelical voters say, well, okay, yeah, I don't really like his tweets, and I don't like it when he's crass and rude to people, but all of these things. So, and the other thing that I think that cannot be underestimated among evangelical voters, and was something that he brought up in, again, this crazy press conference he just had, is his policy on Israel. His moving of the embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv is it's like as big as nominating Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And so that's why when he was asked at the press conference about anti-Semitism and the uptick in hate crimes in the United States, his answer was, Bibi Netanyahu loves me. I moved the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And a message that resonates far more with evangelicals than with Jews, American Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
Bibi, as you said.
Was what?
Mark, you sait Bibi is more popular with evangelicals?
The idea of moving the embassy.
Moving the embassy.
I don't think that's an issue that there's a set of Jews that it motivates, but
No. In fact,
it's kind of the reverse. It's the reverse thing, right? So like 80% or so of evangelicals really like this. 20% of white evangelicals really don't. And it's kind of like the reverse with Jews. Like 20% of them like, the Trump policy and 80% of them don't, roughly, more or less.
Right. And there was a certain amount of bitterness after the Pittsburgh shooting from some American Jews who were like, hey, I hope you're happy with your embassy. The president you're supporting it seems to be conducive to this kind of mass violence. Is it your sense that most of the energy on the right that accounts for the turnout was from the evangelical community? Or do we know? Do we have we probably don't have the numbers, do we?
So the numbers that we have is that 26% of the electorate nationwide were white evangelicals, but they only are 15% of the population. So they turn out, they're really good at turnout. Right. And in some places, they're an enormous part of the electorate. Like in Tennessee, they were 40% of the electorate that elected Marsha Blackburn, who's, really well liked in that community. And so, yes, they're a huge part of the Republican base. And like I said, also, conservative white Catholics, conservative white mainline Protestants. And mixed in with all of that are people, and this is all part of the same base, are people who are motivated by the jobs, not mobs, caravan talk.
Caravan, right. Who may not be evangelicals. I mean,
some of them may be, and they may not be.
And in fact, even Kavanaugh was, when you think about it, really kind of a twofer, because it did represent, on the one hand, it was about Roe versus Wade, but it also was about Me Too. And I know a number of men who aren't evangelicals who will murmur about whether Me Too has gone too far, including some liberals. Right. And so I think that Kavanaugh was a gold mine for them. And of course, the caravan issue, if it sells, it can speak equally to evangelicals and non-evangelicals in Trump's base, I guess, right? Is it the sense of both of you that I think everybody kind of agrees pretty much that Kavanaugh was a factor that ultimately worked against the Democrats, right? Is it? Well, you're shaking your head, Sarah?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think it was very motivating for Republicans, but I think the reason why the Republicans were able to keep the Senate was just because of the map, right? Like the seats that were in play were in heavily red states, right? And, the Democrats pulled it out in some states. John Tester's race was just called today. He won. But, Joe Donnelly lost in Indiana. The Donnelly thing, I don't know. I don't know that you can chalk that up to people, the Kavanaugh thing. I don't know.
I also don't think it was that. I mean, the polls, which turned out to be broadly accurate, showed a little bit of a blip around the time of Kavanaugh in the favor of some of those candidates. Maybe they used that opportunity to consolidate a bit of support that had been sagging. But, so much happens every day in Trump's America that it's really hard to keep Kavanaugh front of mind.
Right. Yeah. Well, what about the caravan? Which do you think that was a motivating issue?
I think it probably was. I mean, it put the issue of. I mean, immigration has been the thing from the beginning of the Tea Party. I mean, it's very central to the Tea Party. That's what all the, really close study of the Tea Party shows. It was very central to Trump. It's always, it's always a bigger issue the further you are from communities that are deeply affected by immigration, or it's a big thing in communities where you begin to have some signs of I always say the place where the parent comes home and says, "Oh my God, there's kids in the kids' school who don't speak English," as if that's a big deal, because that's actually really new and unusual. Whereas for most of us, that's not particularly new and unusual. Places like that, or places that are actually really quite distant from real immigration issues. So it really doesn't matter whether the caravan is 1,000 miles away or 10 miles away or, on another planet. So it clearly, immigration is kind of the big red button that they've been able to push pretty continuously since 2010, even despite things like the Reince Priebus autopsy from 2012 that said we've got to be able to reach Latino voters, and we've got to figure out a way to talk differently about immigration. They've succeeded by ignoring that, and the caravan. It really doesn't matter. The details about the caravan don't really matter. It's just putting that issue back up there on the agenda, even though leaving the politics aside, immigration is A, there's broader acceptance, and B, there's lower levels of attempted illegal entry into the U.S. than there.
Wait, there's broader acceptance of what?
Of on polls, ideas like immigrants on the whole are good for our community, things like that. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable change from the 90s or even 10 years ago.
But one thing I increasingly realize is a certain kind of genius in the way Trump does this stuff. Whether it's conscious or not, I don't know. But because he's so good at kind of outrageous provocation, in other words, like these people 900 miles away heading here on foot, and we're going to send 5,000 troops to the border now. I mean, that itself just strikes us as kind of so crazy that we spend our time going, these people are 900 miles away. Right. This is crazy. Whereas the people on the other side are thinking, okay, but what about when they get here? Is your position that we should just let everyone who wants to come in? And when you think about it, you don't hear many liberals find the occasion to say, and not all of them believe this, but many do, to say, I want to be clear, I don't think that countries shouldn't be able to control their borders. I don't think we should let everyone in. It's just that blah, they don't. Right. We so react to Trump's provocations that that there's almost not that much actual substantive discussion of the issue. And I know that there are people who are open borders people. And in fact, I think Trump has increased the number of people on the left who are open borders because you just kind of react against him. But at the same time, I'm starting to appreciate how his continually distracting us from actual substantive debate works in his favor.
Right. And do you really want to be pulled into that? I mean, even folks like, I think David Frum has said things like that. Well, liberals, you need to say what your plan is when these people do get to the border. Right. And I don't feel like doing that. I mean, the plan is they present themselves for asylum. Either they have strong claims or they don't. I don't happen to know. If I were elected to the Senate or I were president, I'd probably have a broader definition of who we accept of asylum than prevails now, and other people might have a narrower definition. Right. But we'll live with whatever definition we have. And if they're primarily economic migrants, they're not going to be granted asylum. And if they really have, legit, I can't remember, well-founded fear of persecution based for other reasons, they may be granted asylum. And we have a process, and they're in fact evangelical and other religious-based networks that bring in refugees, and the status quo is fine with me. The status quo doesn't need 5,000 troops on the border, and I'm kind of resistant to restating the status quo, which is present your claim for asylum at the border and let it be adjudicated.
Yeah, but even that, I think, would be an advance over a lot of the discussion that actually happens. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing it.
Well, I think what Trump is counting on is that most people don't know how the asylum process works, right? What Mark was just talking about is based on his knowledge of how the asylum process works or has worked under previous administrations. But most people don't know that. Like, most people don't know that, there's a process for refugees from, political or religious persecution who, they can come to a port of entry and seek asylum in the United States. And that we used to have a process for adjudicating those claims and either letting people stay or not. But Trump is counting on, people don't know that. So Trump is counting on, right. He's just counting on people having the same level of knowledge that he has. He instead is just going to go for the scare tactic, right? And so if you rile up a base of people with your scare tactic about mobs and invasions and criminals and disease, which is all of the catchwords that he uses, then it's really hard for somebody to say, oh, but wait, we have this process and they seek asylum and they have to take this step and that step. And, then people get bored with that. Like he's the perennial entertainer, like everything is performative, and all of that overwhelms reason and process and everything that we think is supposed to be the way something like this is supposed to work. And that's part of how he succeeds, by shutting down that kind of conversation and elevating the shouting about mobs and caravans and so forth.
That's kind of what I mean. I mean, that's he's good at starting shouting matches. And shouting matches nothing energizes his base like a shouting match, because his whole premise is we're these crazy people who hate them. And so, I mean, I guess I would say, I don't know. It seems to me that he didn't do a bad job of turning out his base, is what I'd say, in this election, given the cards he had. I mean, at the same time, given how well the economy is doing, and given how gerrymandered much of the country is by Republican state legislatures, he shouldn't, in one sense, be happy about, the Republicans losing the House vote by an average of 9%. But and Democrats can take some some pride or happiness in that, and also, as people noted, Democrats picked up 7 gubernatorial, including in swing states.
Let's talk about that. I mean, I do think that, Scott Walker lost.
Yeah. That
was huge for the Republicans, because I think a lot of their sort of pre-Trump agenda was embodied in Scott Walker. And I think, obviously the majority of voters in Wisconsin were tired of that too. I think that there was a lot of good news for Democrats and a lot of bad news for Trump electorally. Right. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that, these sorts of things go back and forth, right? The Tea Party wave, and then the Democrats, can't come. Well, no, they haven't controlled this House since then. But what I'm saying is, they go back and forth, and this victory for the Democrats in the House is not forever. And so we have to keep our eyes on what it is Trump is doing in the face of it, and what kind of groundwork he's laying for future Republicans who might not be as crass and crude and terrible as he is, but might embody some of the same authoritarian instincts and some of the same xenophobic policies. And we have to keep an eye on how he uses those to motivate voters, even when he loses. Because even when he loses, we need to keep in mind for the next election that might work in a future election, even if it didn't work for them.
Well, and I guess one thing I'm kind of thinking, if not saying, is the outcome of this, however in many ways favorable to Democrats, the outcome of this election made it more likely that they will follow his playbook. In other words, if you imagine that the Senate race, they picked up 0 seats or even lost a seat,
right,
then I think the narrative right now would be very different. There would be more people saying, I'm not sure we should have signed on with this guy. But they're not saying that, because they did a little better in the Senate than anticipated, and what happened in the House was what they expected. And I guess that's one of the things that I think is an actual concrete consequence of this election in terms of the Republican Party's future, right?
Right. And it helps that Trump doesn't do, all the soul searching and I've learned my lessons and we got thumped and all that stuff that, Clinton did and Bush did in 2006. And of course, Obama did in 2010. He has none of that. He's not interested in that. And a little bit of that kind of bluffing kind of gets you through. There's no other path. There were Democrats who switched parties after the 94 election. There are Democrats who, just freaked out about Bill Clinton. There was an internal backlash against Obama. The numbers in 2010 were pretty big. But in and of themselves, it was a similar popular vote wave or whatever. But if you kind of concede nothing, you can hold that ground. And there's no non-Trump path right now for Republicans. I think there will be eventually. I think they'll have to.
There's a bit of
a downturn in the economy changes a lot of calculations.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the part about the economy.
Well, between now and 2020, the economy is not going to be at a 3.7% unemployment rate for another 2 years. Unless we've really that every time there's a dream like that, it proves false. Yeah. A bit of a downturn in the economy, and people, Trump's numbers will probably start to look different. Trump's numbers really are just hilariously unlike Obama. Obama was around, I guess he was in like the high 60s, and then he just plummeted to the point where he was close to where Obama is now, especially in 2014. But Obama, Trump he got 46% of the vote, and he's at 44 now, and it really hasn't changed. It's bounced around. Yeah. Sometimes dips below 40, but the range is so much narrower than Obama or Clinton had, or Bush.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Georgia?
Yeah, we can. And apparently the concession has not been made there yet, right? Abrams has not conceded. Sure.
So it's such a 2018 election, that gubernatorial race between Kemp and Abrams, because you have someone who worked as an activist registering voters of color, and her opponent, who is Secretary of State and tried and in many cases succeeded in disenfranchising voters of color. And now you see this margin between them, which, was clearly impacted, and her whatever deficit she's in was clearly impacted by the disenfranchisement of voters of color by her opponent. It's just such an extraordinary story of these two candidates and this state whose demographics are changing, this state that's, in the Deep South and has such a history with, the civil rights movement and discrimination. And I feel like it's not getting the national attention that it deserves, because it's this little petri dish of the very issues that are dividing America over Trump, right? Is there voter suppression or is there voter fraud? Are white people the ones who are under siege, or do people of color still experience discrimination? Like when you look at the exit polling data from Georgia, they ask these questions like, do you think that, that Black people have too many special rights? Like they asked questions like that in the exit poll. And of course, the people who thought that Black people have too many special rights, like overwhelmingly were voting for Brian Kemp, and, the reverse with Stacey Abrams. And it's just like this, this amazing microcosm of America, and this amazing microcosm of, are the suburban voters of Atlanta, like suburban voters all over America, you're really changing the face of the electorate? And the answer is probably yes. And the reason why Stacey Abrams isn't winning is because of this sort of structural voter suppression by the Republican, who happens to also be the Secretary of State. It's just extraordinary, and I feel like it should be the thing that pundits on TV are chewing over nonstop, and it's not getting any play at all.
Right. And there was very little, for all the analysis of Florida last night, I saw very little poking around at Georgia. And of course, Georgia's 6th flip, that was the seat that, the seat they called Ossoff without Ossoff, which was a Black woman won that suburban seat. So you have a little bit, dynamics a little bit similar to Texas, right? Where something will happen, but is it 5 years away? Is it 10 years away? Who really knows? There's a point where potentially it begins to look a little more like Virginia or even like North Carolina. But at the same time, I haven't seen a Democrat win statewide in Georgia since, maybe Max Cleland. It's been quite a long time. And usually they lose by a lot more. And usually they are, Michelle Nunn, who seemed like a fabulous candidate, and her father had been senator, and she was, effective, and she got crushed in a Senate race by probably 12 points or so. Jimmy Carter's grandson got crushed. I mean, they sort of do the same, acceptable white candidate, and nothing happens. And that's sort of basically the same thing in Texas. You put, you have a candidate.
But Beto was not just the acceptable white candidate. He was sort of like a rock star candidate.
Right. Beto was a different candidate. There have been a lot of sort of acceptable white candidates in Texas who also lost by 15 points. And Beto, who energized people, came within 3 now, I think. And Stacey Abrams, who energized people and energized black voters, and certainly on a, if everybody could vote without any issues, certainly would have won. So the lesson is you're definitely a lot better off with a candidate like that than an ordinary mainstream white candidate with a name well known in the state. And same with Bill Bredesen, who was, last elected in that state 8 or 10 years ago. But it still isn't enough, and there is obviously some backlash against those candidates as well.
Well, yeah, and aren't some people spinning this the other way in the Democratic Party? I mean, aren't they saying, well, these progressive rock stars didn't win. The people left of center didn't win. The prominent examples of that. And so, we need your basic, moderates going forward. I mean, I think that's a more, of course, it's always weird the way these narratives happen because, as you've just kind of said, 100,000 votes shift in Florida and Georgia and Texas, or maybe 200,000 in Texas, and you got a totally different narrative. But still, this is the way narratives happen. And I think a common takeaway right now is let's cool it on the left if we really want to get Donald Trump out of. And I'm talking maybe both about congressional strategy going forward and about selection of a presidential candidate for 2020, right?
Well, one other thing I wanted to bring up in the context of the Abrams-Kemp race and the Gillum-DeSantis race was the gubernatorial race in Maryland, where Ben Jealous was a candidate who was very much like Stacey Abrams or Andrew Gillum, a black Democrat who has, experience working in the civil rights movement, was the president of the NAACP, and an incumbent, moderate Republican white governor. And I mean, Jealous withered away. I mean, Hogan won handily. They called the race the instant the polls closed in Maryland. And when you look at the precinct by precinct voting, it's just extraordinary how in these wealthy, white, and very Democratic areas of Montgomery County, Maryland, went heavily for Hogan. And so you have to ask yourself, are all suburban white Democratic voters really okay with black candidates who are, to the left? And I think that there's some evidence in Maryland that they're not. And that was also kind of extraordinary.
But isn't Jealous kind of considered a less good talented candidate than
Abrams? Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. She far and away, I think, was the best. If we're looking at those 3 candidates, she far and away was the best of them. But I think that there were among progressives, a lot of high hopes for Jealous, and he did win a contested Democratic primary in Maryland.
Yeah.
I mean, Ben Jealous and Stacey Abrams are both people who I've come across maybe 7-8 years ago. I actually met Ben Jealous 6 jobs ago. He's one of those people who you say, this guy's extraordinarily talented. And the same with Abrams. I guess I wouldn't fully buy that analysis, Sarah, because part of Ben Jealous's problem, I think, is there are 2 established, super organized black voting bases in Maryland, which are PG and Baltimore, and he wasn't quite from either one, so he didn't have a big boost from either of those places. And I looked a bit at PG, I didn't look at Montgomery,
right.
So he didn't quite have the boost that same problem that the candidate who ran against Hogan the first time had, because he was a PG candidate with no Baltimore credibility.
Right. And I agree with you. I agree with you.
You could overcome the Montgomery County white suburbanites if you get the big boost from black turnout.
Maybe, yeah. And I haven't looked at the PG or the Baltimore data, but I was just struck by the Montgomery County data, where you would think that he would have been more appealing in this Trump saturated election, where you would presumably have voters, white suburban liberal voters, right, who don't like Trump, and just, you know, even though Hogan isn't a Trump a Trump candidate like Brian Kemp or Ron DeSantis is, but still like would vote against the Republican just because we're in the Trump era.
So I year in and year out, I just feel more and more like there is a kind of strategic voting that particularly plays out in a way that people in the Northeast kind of like having a liberal Democratic legislature and a moderate Republican governor who's sort of a check on that legislature. I mean, you now have, Massachusetts has had Republican governors with one exception since Dukakis. Connecticut was a lot closer than I thought it would be, and they've had a lot of Republican governors until the last one, and now Ned Lamont. It just seems like that's a situation that people like.
Okay, so can we talk a little about the concrete implications going forward at a couple of levels? Let's start out with just an informational question from me, because this is something I really don't understand, is like exactly why governors matter. I mean, again, the Democrats picked up 7 seats, 7 gubernatorial, whatever you call those houses, if not seats. But, I had always thought, as far as, drawing the districts and gerrymandering, I had always thought that's fundamentally a state legislature thing, but I guess you tell me what in concrete policy. Well, I mean, obviously at the level of state policy, governors matter, but in terms of federal politics, like in a presidential election or in the next congressional election, why do governors matter?
Well, I mean, on the redistricting, to do a fully partisan redistricting, you need like what they did in Pennsylvania, for example, that got overturned by the courts. You need a trifecta. You need both houses of the legislature and the governor.
Okay.
So the governor is just one of those factors, and if you have a Democratic governor, you're better off. And if you have a Democratic trifecta, in theory, you could do a Democratic redistricting. Would be one reason. And popular governors can become Senate candidates. Popular governors can become presidential candidates pretty easily, so they matter in that respect. And they're finding their way to more and more kinds of policies. Like, I do think there will be a larger group of Democratic governors working on interstate compacts around climate change, for example.
Okay.
And that's a very big deal. If you have a Northeast Midwest cluster that's doing that, and then a West Coast cluster, that's, to the extent that that's the most profound challenge we face, that's the only way we're going to make any progress on that. So, they matter in that respect. And then there are lots of basic conditions of life. Does the governor support an increase in the, $15 minimum wage? Does the governor support paid family leave? I mean, all those things matter a lot. And if the federal government's not going to do anything about it, you're really driven to do it. And a governor like Andrew Cuomo is going to govern very differently in his third term than he did in his first 2 terms, partly because he has a real supportive Democratic legislature. He knows what he needs to do to be considered a successful Democratic governor. So you're going to have, between Illinois, New York, Michigan, millions and millions of people for whom the conditions of life are going to be different, and will also change their overall view of Democrats. Partly Democrats are unpopular because nobody sees a Democrat doing anything good for them when they're living in Wisconsin. You see Tammy Baldwin's sort of on your side, but you don't see her delivering anything that's changing your life. And I think that's like 5 of the many reasons that governors really do matter.
And I think on the 2020 issue, it mattered a lot to Trump that DeSantis win that governor's race in Florida, because now he has a very loyal foot soldier in the governor's mansion in a state that he absolutely has to win.
And what does that foot soldier do as a practical matter during elections that helps?
Endorse him, campaign with him. Yep.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure that stuff mattered as much as it used to in kind of old school.
Well, it also depends on whether, also DeSantis clearly has a network within the state that helped elect him that he can activate on Trump's behalf. And if DeSantis is popular as governor, if he's not popular as governor, that, poses an issue for Trump, I think, in 2020. But I think it's really that DeSantis was able to activate a base of voters, because I think he wouldn't have been able to win statewide. Otherwise, his first statewide race, he was a congressman from Florida before this. And so I think that that's going to be very key to Trump.
And as long as we're in Florida, how significant do you think it is that apparently in 2020, I understand 1.4 million convicted felons in Florida will now be able to vote because of a referendum? Now, I think there's a tendency to assume that's largely a Democratic vote. I mean, I would think that there's a lot of white felons, certainly including white collar criminal felons, but who would vote for Trump? I mean, so I would think actually, I don't know, is it a known fact that if you can get them to turn out, that's like a big thing for Democrats?
I saw a statistic that population is actually majority white, although obviously less majority white than the state as a whole, and turnout it will be excruciatingly difficult to pull off. But it will be part of the mobilization the mobilization within the black community, which Gillum probably, there are things he figured out that probably nobody else had figured out about modes of organizing and building new networks and new organizations within the African American communities within Florida, which are varied and very different. That work will be more effective when you don't have to tell 1 in 4 black men, oh, never mind, you're actually ineligible.
Right.
I think it'll come in that way, but it's not going to be like, oh, there's 1.4 million more Democratic votes. That's definitely not how it's going to play out.
So what about what can a Democratic Congress do, and what do you think they should do? I mean, it's famously now they have the power to hold hearings, to subpoena White House documents, conceivably Trump's tax records. There are two views on the wisdom of this, of exercising this very vigorously. There's danger of overreach, seeming like you're persecuting him, and kind of getting in Mueller's way to some extent, and like clouding those two narratives into just a giant blur or something. There's all these arguments. There's arguments for and arguments against. Do you two have views on that?
I think that the Democrats absolutely have to hold this new authoritarian president that we have accountable. I mean, there's no question they would be derelict in their responsibilities if they were to not pursue hearings and subpoenas and so forth. I think the trick for them is in the public presentation, and to make it not too overwhelming and confusing for the public to understand. And the example that comes to my mind in all of this is that amazing New York Times deep dive into Trump's taxes and his basically lifelong tax fraud. And what happened to that story? It's a huge story, right? The president of the United States has basically, like, for decades committed tax fraud.
Yeah.
But it's sort of just like...
Can I make a little point about that? First of all, it was badly timed. I forget which story it kind of stepped on, but there was some huge story unfolding.
Okay, there's always going to be a huge story.
But the other thing is, you know what? That should have been 2 pieces, because the billing that they kind of focused on was Trump actually got a lot of money from his father.
Yeah.
He's not really a self-made man.
Yes.
They almost made that the lead of the whole story involving the actual law breaking. It should have been a 2-part series. Today, Trump was massively subsidized by his father. Next day story, his whole family should be in prison. You know,
but what you're saying
was really badly done. I mean,
right.
They can't help the timing. I forget which story they walked into. But I think that was a mistake. It was too big a story.
Right.
They didn't differentiate.
But that's exactly my point with what the Democrats have to do with explaining to the public what they're doing with all of these investigations, right? Because all of this stuff to a lot of people who aren't political junkies and don't spend their days like we do, you know, consuming all of the facts and information about what's going on, it seems just like a fire hose of information and they don't know how to take it in, right? And so part of the Democrats' challenge is not only doing the work, but presenting it to the public with reasons why they're doing it, what their work has shown so far, or why the president's refusal to submit to a subpoena or provide the documents or what have you matters. And without doing it in a way that's going to completely overwhelm them with information. That's the challenge that the news media has had, specifically, like case in point, that New York Times story. And I think that that's a serious challenge for the Democrats, because they not only have to do the work, but they have to present it to the public, and they have to present it to the public in a way that's going to be graspable for people, and in a why it matters kind of way.
Okay.
I mean, and the magnitude of it, you put the tax stuff together with, I thought the lawsuit about just a couple weeks ago about Trump's sort of multi-level marketing scams, like the thing where they're selling video phones.
Right.
You know, in a pyramid scheme in 2009, you know,
I
literally
forgot about that.
standalone devices that would do, you know, you had blogging heads in 2009. You don't need a standalone video phone for that kind of nonsense. It was just like 4 or 5 of just outrageous scams. But that's such a tiny fraction of all the Trump stories. And, you know, even as somebody who absorbs too much, who wastes far too much of my day on this, it's, you know, there's no way to actually grasp it unless you become one of those people with the ribbons and the thumbtacks and the photos on your wall and making all those crazy connections. And, you know, I'm totally you're totally dependent on like the few people who can keep all that stuff in their head, like say Marcy Wheeler, you know, or just like without him we'd be lost. But I've always felt like, okay, historically speaking, for these things to really connect to people, you had to have hearings. You know, Watergate without hearings is not Watergate. It's just some stuff that's in the Washington Post at a time when nobody read the Washington Post. You know, I mean, Iran-Contra was still, I don't think anybody ever got their head around that one, but, you know, at least there were hearings that brought it front and center and had some impact. You know, there's so many different kinds of hearings and things to do, and there are things that there's like a zone that affects people's lives. Like I think we should be looking at, you know, there should be hearings about Betsy DeVos, and there should be hearings about how they threw out all the student loan regulations and all the people who are affected by that. And you know, a half dozen other things and 24 on the environment front that are directly affecting people's lives. Super important. But then also the, you know, really getting to the point where people understand what the Trump story is. You know, it's not going to happen by magic. I think Mueller will help, but just to figure out the stagecraft of this, and the fact that every single Republican is going to treat it as political. I mean, Trump's press conference attitude of like, hey, 2 can play at that game. It's like, no, 2 actually can't play at that game because one is a criminal and one is not, you know. But if you have the idea, you know, like there is well-founded reason to have these hearings and these issues with Trump. And, you know, but if you're able to treat it as just, you know, we'll treat it as a political game because Benghazi was a political game and the IRS scandal was a political game. And hey, they're all political games and we can all play them.
But Mark, isn't it easier in the current environment to effectively dismiss it as a political game? What I mean is that I'm raising a question about whether hearings matter the way they used to in the old days.
Right.
When we had 3 TV networks, or even more recently. I mean, now you've got these 2 different media ecosystems that are going to process the news in completely predictable ways. I mean, you saw this like even with the Nunes, when Nunes was running things, every once in a while he probably raised a legitimate question. I don't know. It didn't matter. People on my side weren't going to take it seriously. They weren't going to give him that much credit. And when Democrats are running the hearings, all the people who like Trump are basically going to be tuned in to an ecosystem that tells them not to pay any attention. I really wonder whether hearings matter the way they used to. You saw this in a different way with this poll today showing that 46% of the people think Mueller has gone too far. He hasn't gone anywhere. We haven't even heard from him yet. Right. And only 41% think he hasn't or something. So I wonder whether you get the question, do hearings matter anymore?
Well, I mean, I think we'll find out. There's obviously a reason they didn't want to do them before. They really fought hard. Nunes and Burr on the Senate side did everything possible, and on the Judiciary Committees as well, everything possible to prevent any kind of public hearing. And if Adam Schiff, is willing to do some public hearings, and Nadler is willing to do public hearings, which is easier for Nadler because he doesn't have to worry about classified information. The day when Michael Cohen sits up there and says, yes, Mr. Trump asked me to do X, Y, Z, and then there's something else and something else, all bolstered by Mueller. I'm not ready to say that won't matter, but I'm not confident it will matter. But I definitely want to get to that day.
Yeah, I think the thing that I worry about is we talk a lot about the shattering of norms under the Trump presidency. And I think that we were on our way to that before the Trump presidency. And like you brought up Benghazi and the IRS hearings, right? Like those were just ridiculous show trials, right? And so that diminished the power and the importance and the relevance of congressional hearings and congressional oversight. And so the Republicans had already shattered that norm before we got Trump. And so I think that the big open question is, when the Democrats do it, will it matter now?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm not accusing the Democrats of engaging in a show trial. Should they do any of these things? I think these things are actually important. It's because the Republicans made the show trial out of it that it might diminish.
Right. I mean, hopefully, sentient human beings see the difference between Adam Schiff and Jim Jordan, Hopefully, because there's a huge difference between those people in terms of seriousness and everything else. But maybe that's one of those things.
We may have bad news for you on that front, Mark. I don't know. I guess we'll wait and see what happens. But anyway, we've come back around to what we promised to touch on a little, which is that I didn't even know until I signed on and you told me that that Jeff Sessions has basically been forced to resign. Is he already history? He's done the resigning?
Yep. He sent the letter to the White House. Yeah.
It says, at your request, I'm resigning.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah, the scenarios you were running through before we started taping involved Trump finding a way to exert more authority over the Mueller investigation. I mean, do you think, whether it's by getting rid of Rosenstein or whatever, but do you think that's as far as it goes, or does this go as far as just firing Mueller and just like?
Well, I think that there's a chain of command within the Department of Justice that would have to take place to fire Mueller, which would be made easier if Trump can nominate a new attorney general. His fresh Republican, even the old Republican led Senate will presumably confirm that person. Yeah. And now, if that happens, then Rod Rosenstein will no longer be overseeing the Mueller investigation because presumably this new AG would not have to recuse him or herself like Sessions had to. So
this is one reason it really would have mattered immediately if the Democrats could have won the Senate, for starters.
Absolutely.
And one thing I've wondered is, does Mueller, if I were him, I would have gone ahead and prepared some preliminary report. And I'd have it set to send out to everyone in Congress, one button. And here, the email is out. If I hear I'm being summoned to the White House, or even Trump is on the other line, mm-hmm. But because I wonder whether there is the possibility of all of this stuff actually going down a rat hole and never, I don't know. It seems hard to imagine.
There was some reporting right before the election, right before this midterm election, that Mueller had some kind of report nearly in hand or in hand. And there was, I can't remember where it was, I think it was Vanity Fair reporting that he might even release it this week or maybe later this month. Who knows, what the sourcing on that was. Obviously, Mueller's shop is notoriously tight-lipped, so that sourcing might have come from, somebody outside Mueller's shop, so who knows if it's accurate or not. But I think that go ahead.
I've always thought the problem with that scenario, which is, I hold that fantasy as well. I've always thought the problem with it is you still have to put the thing through a declassification process. You can't just hit send. And that's where it would get hung up. I think.
Aren't there a bunch of people?
There are two things though. I mean, Mueller speaks in indictments, so he could drop a couple of indictments on his way out the door. He's also farmed out some indictments.
Right.
So he's brought a lot of different or several different U.S. attorneys' offices into the game. So that's been a form of protection for him that will make it probably impossible to just end the whole thing right there. I mean, obviously, a judge might refuse to dismiss a charge if a new prosecutor came in and wanted to dismiss.
Aren't there?
If he indicts Roger Stone and Don Jr. tomorrow,
Yeah. Aren't there a number of people in Congress who have a status as far as their classification level, such that he could give them a report without it going through that, or not? Because if
they wouldn't be able to make any of it public.
What?
I mean, they
no, right. But I mean, if you send it to 50 people in Congress, it is public, right? I mean, it's going to, some staffer is going to leak it.
No, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that first of all, it's not 50. It's really the intelligence chairs and the judiciary chairs. Is that right, Sarah?
I know it's the intelligence chairs. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I guess the gang of 4 is just the intelligence chair.
Well, this is disturbing.
And there's stuff that Adam Schiff has seen that he has not leaked and that he is not talking about.
And Mark Warner too.
And Mark Warner too. And sometimes it's very clear that they've done that. And like Mueller, they're not casual about that stuff. They're not actually Devin Nunes.
No, but I would imagine that if the report got to them and then Mueller got fired, they would think about the whole thing a little differently. I mean, that we're talking about a kind of a constitutional crisis at that point, and I would think that they might want to be pretty sure that this was not a successful act of suppression by Trump, but who knows?
I think that they would be very reluctant to leak classified information. I mean,
and I have no problem with that.
Yeah, I mean,
you have no problem with the fact that they would be reluctant, you mean?
Right. I mean, I'm thinking about that as I say it because I know there's huge amounts of overclassification, and that's I'm comfortable in a world where individual elected members follow the rules about what to do with classified information. I wish Devin Nunes had,
Mm-hmm.
Right. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know. What do I know? But I mean, once a president does something that, I mean, do you agree that this would be essentially trigger a constitutional crisis if he really either fired Mueller or basically just shut down the operation somehow?
I feel like we use the word constitutional crisis kind of casually. I mean, it would be bad. There would be a big fight. I don't know. I'm not sure there's a constitutional claim,
right,
that applies there. There probably isn't. So,
but I think it's a crisis of some kind. I think that we use the term constitutional crisis, but it's like it's definitely a crisis, and I think maybe we should just call it what it is, which is a crisis of authoritarianism.
Let's downgrade it to an existential crisis from a constitutional crisis.
No, I mean, like the issue is it's an abuse of power, right? And it's abuse of power in order to protect himself and his family and his cronies, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, a constitutional crisis sort of suggests that I don't know. Like, I don't know what they mean by a constitutional crisis, but it's definitely a crisis, right? And like I said, I think that, maybe it's better to like call it what it is, and that it's like a crisis of abuse of executive power, abuse of power, abuse of, something, right? And that actually names it more specifically than a constitutional crisis.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I mean, one thing people often evince ignorance of is the fact that the president does run the Justice Department, right? I mean, it's a branch of the executive government. Now, there are norms surrounding his relationship with it, right? But in some technical sense, on the org chart, he runs it, right?
Yes, but when he or his campaign manager or his son are potentially the targets or the subjects of a criminal or a counterintelligence investigation, he cannot interfere with that, and he can't dictate to the Justice Department, I think you should be investigating the Black Panthers and not the National Socialist Party or something like that. I mean, he can make signal broad policy desires, but he can't just to use an overused word, meddle in that. But I think that in another Trumpian change of how we think about things, I think that he has in some ways succeeded in portraying it that way when he talks about my Justice Department and things like that.
But it's interesting to note, even Jeff Sessions, who's really an egregiously bad person and a racist, and was himself involved in some of this, activity with, at least the Russian ambassador, maybe others. Even he understood my obligation is not to act as the president's Roy Cohn, as right. The president likes to say, but to actually be the attorney general, and that he had a responsibility to recuse himself. So that there's something that remains of those norms, or at least remained with Jeff Sessions, and we'll see. I mean, I think there are people there are potential nominees for that role, like Noel Francisco, who's the Solicitor General, people who know him say he wouldn't even have those qualms.
Right.
But I don't know that. I don't know that myself.
I mean, I guess if nothing else, him doing something like Trump doing something like what we're describing would ensure that Congress, the House, became very aggressive on the hearings front, right? I mean, they would investigate this itself, right? And presumably use that investigation to publicize as many of Mueller's findings as possible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. It got weird pretty fast. The other question is civil outrage. I mean, would you see people in the streets? And so I guess final question is, aside from the hearings, does the House have anything they can do to constrain his intervention in a Justice Department investigation? Probably not, right?
Probably no.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anything else either of you wants to say about any of this before we?
No, I mean, I think this is a good conversation. I'm really interested. Maybe do this again and talk about. I talk a little bit about the shape of progressive politics that emerged last night and yesterday, or over the past couple of years. I mean, I've been really interested. We talked a little bit about how it wasn't like a super big win for the star progressives, mm-hmm. and I think that's right. And I think that there was a kind of basic Democrat who did well, which I think is, I'm not in the third way, be a moderate camp at all, but the party's going to. I'm glad we're not in a mode where we say the only way to be a Democrat is to just go all out on Medicare for all. I mean, I think that's going to be. I think that's what a lot of Democrats should be talking about. I think a broad range of approaches that are majoritarian but get people fired up, I think will be good in the long run. But that's just my general. That to me, that's the thing. I'm more interested in that than some of the other issues about House power and so forth.
Okay. Sarah, anything?
It was a good conversation.
It was a good conversation. I think we should declare this the inauguration of this new format a triumph. And without objection,
you have the power to make those declarations.
Without objection, it is so ordered. So thank you both. Tell us where we can find you on Twitter or anywhere else you want to be found.
Well, I am trying to take a little hiatus from Twitter because I'm writing a book and it's a huge distraction, but my
so
Twitter
then people should knock on your door if they want to communicate with you. Is that what you're telling us?
No.
Or what's the book about, Sarah?
About, Trump and the Trump coalition. But no, don't come knock on my door. But my Twitter handle is Sarah Posner, just my name.
And Mark, is yours Mark?
My Twitter handle is mschmitt9, with M Schmitt with 2 T's, mschmitt9, and I am so achingly close to 4,000 followers. And I have been for a long time.
We'll send him over the top, folks.
Yeah, I think I need 19 people now to send me over the top. So I either send out some dog pictures, which I don't have, or something inflammatory, or I just count on blogging.
Inflammatory is what works. This is the problem with this is the reason if we ever wind up in a civil war, the reason will be that the way to pick up followers on Twitter is to be as tribal and inflammatory as possible.
Yeah, but if your goal is 4,000, I think I could get there without that.
Yeah, well, you couldn't be part of the problem yet, but you're headed. I can sense that you're headed in that direction. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Let's do this again. This was great.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you, Bob.
Okay, see ya.